Before we begin, take a moment to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss stories like this one. Today's story is about a single mother and her son, a forgotten house hidden in the mountains, and a secret buried in its walls that changes everything. If you enjoy slow, atmospheric stories about resilience, hidden histories, and quiet transformation, you're in the right place. Stay with us and be sure to watch the next videos on the channel. And if this story speaks to you, share it with someone who might feel it too. For most of her adult life, Chloe Madden had learned to measure her days by what might go wrong rather than by what might improve. Stability, when it appeared, felt provisional, as if it had been granted temporarily and could be withdrawn without warning. She lived with her son Noah in a modest rented apartment on the outer edge of a Pennsylvania suburb, close enough to the city to feel its pressure, but far enough away to miss its opportunities. The apartment itself was unremarkable, a place defined less by comfort than by function. The walls were thin, the windows imperfect, the heating system loud and unreliable. Chloe did not complain about it, not aloud. It was shelter, and shelter was enough, as long as nothing unexpected happened. Nothing unexpected, however, was a fragile wish to build a life upon. Chloe worked irregular hours, piecing together income from a job that barely covered rent, utilities, and food. Every month felt like a calculation that had to be redone from scratch. Every unexpected expense a threat to the balance she maintained through discipline and quiet endurance. She had become skilled at postponing her own needs, at smoothing the edges of worry so they did not spill over into Noah's world. He was 9 years old, observant in a way that made her careful, sensitive to changes in tone and routine even when she tried to hide them. He did well in school, though he rarely spoke about it, and he moved through his days with a kind of contained attention that sometimes made Chloe wonder how much of her own anxiety had already shaped him. The letter arrived on an ordinary Tuesday, indistinguishable at first from the other envelopes that appeared in their mailbox with mechanical regularity. Chloe found it folded among grocery advertisements and a utility bill she already knew would require careful timing. The envelope was heavier than most, its paper thicker, the return address unfamiliar. It bore the seal of a county court in West Virginia, a place name that stirred something distant and indistinct in her memory. For a moment she considered setting it aside unopened, postponing whatever obligation it might carry until she felt better prepared to face it. Experience had taught her that official letters rarely arrived with good news. She opened it standing in the kitchen, still wearing her coat, the faint chill of early winter clinging to her clothes. The language inside was formal and restrained, stripped of sentiment or explanation. It informed her that she had been identified as the nearest surviving relative of a deceased property holder, a distant relation whose name she recognized only faintly, a woman mentioned occasionally in family stories and then quickly forgotten. The property in question was described in detached terms, identified by parcel number and location, rather than by any sense of value. It was a structure situated on a wooded slope in the Appalachian region of West Virginia, long unoccupied and officially classified as non-residential, due to prolonged vacancy and lack of recorded maintenance. The letter explained that the estate had passed through probate without contest, and that Chloe was required to either accept or formally decline the inheritance within a fixed period. There was no mention of worth, no indication of whether the property represented an asset or a liability. It existed on the page as a responsibility rather than a gift, framed in deadlines and procedural requirements. Chloe read the letter several times, hoping repetition might clarify what it did not explicitly say. A house, if it could be called that. Land, distance, unknown costs, unknown risks. Her first reaction was irritation edged with exhaustion. The inheritance did not feel like opportunity. It felt like complication, another variable introduced into a life already defined by careful constraint. She folded the letter and set it aside, telling herself she would deal with it later. That evening, after Noah had gone to bed and the apartment had settled into its familiar quiet, she read it again. This time she paid closer attention to the details. The property had changed hands multiple times within the same extended family, passed down without ever being sold, renovated, or developed. Each transfer seemed less intentional than the last, as if no one had wanted to be the one to finally sever the line of responsibility. The next day, she called her mother. The conversation confirmed what the letter suggested, but did not explain. Yes, the house existed. Yes, it had belonged to a relative whose life had gradually narrowed into obscurity. No, no one in the family had visited it in decades. It had always been described as remote, impractical, and strange, not worth the trouble of maintaining or reclaiming. The house, Chloe was told, was something people endured as an obligation until they could pass it along again. When Chloe mentioned the possibility of seeing it in person, her mother's hesitation was unmistakable. It was not worth the effort, she was advised. It was better to decline and let the county resolve it. After the call ended, Chloe sat alone in the dim living room long after the television had been turned off. She thought about the lease renewal that loomed in the coming months, the rent increase hinted at but not yet specified. She thought about how little margin for error her life allowed. She did not imagine the inherited property as a solution. She imagined it as a question she could not entirely dismiss. Declining it would be simple, final, another door closed without ever knowing what lay beyond it. Accepting it, even temporarily, would mean choosing uncertainty over stagnation. 2 weeks later, she packed the car. She told herself it was a visit, not a commitment. An inspection, nothing more. She explained to Noah that they were taking a short trip to see a place that had once belonged to family. He accepted this explanation without resistance, though without enthusiasm. They packed lightly, taking only what would fit easily in the trunk: clothes for a few days, basic food, blankets, a handful of tools Chloe already owned. The decision was made quietly without ceremony, but once it was made, it felt irreversible. The drive took them south and east, away from highways and familiar landmarks. As the miles passed, the roads narrowed and the terrain shifted. Towns thinned into clusters of houses, then into occasional structures set back from the road. Cell service weakened and disappeared. Chloe relied on printed directions she had prepared in advance, following them with careful attention as the pavement gave way to gravel, and then to something barely recognizable as a maintained road. The forest closed in around them, tall and dense, the trees pressing closer together as if to limit the sky. When they reached the final turn, Chloe slowed the car almost to a stop. The house did not announce itself. It emerged gradually from the slope, a stone structure partially embedded in the hillside, its form shaped by the land rather than imposed upon it. It appeared modest in size but deliberate in construction, terraced in a way that suggested it had been designed to recede into the earth rather than stand apart from it. There was no cleared yard, no fence, no sign that the surrounding forest had ever been tamed. Chloe turned off the engine and sat for a moment in silence. The absence of sound felt immediate and complete, broken only by the faint movement of wind through branches. Noah leaned forward, peering through the windshield, taking in the structure with open curiosity. Up close, the house felt less abandoned than she had expected. The stone walls were weathered but intact. The door, though heavy and scarred by time, opened without resistance. Inside, the air was cool but steady. Not cold, not damp. The floor was stone, worn smooth in places. The walls combined timber and packed earth, shaped by hands that had understood the material they worked with. Light entered through small windows, revealing a space that felt deliberate rather than improvised. Noah stepped inside and removed his jacket without being prompted. Chloe noticed the gesture before she understood it. The temperature inside did not demand protection. They explored cautiously, moving from one level to the next through narrow passages that angled upward into the hillside. The house unfolded gradually, revealing rooms that felt carved rather than constructed, spaces defined by function rather than decoration. There were signs of long-ago habitation, but nothing that suggested recent collapse or decay. That night, they slept wrapped in blankets on the lowest level. Chloe lay awake listening to the forest, waiting for sounds that never came. The temperature inside remained unchanged. In the morning, frost coated the ground outside the door. Inside, the air felt the same as it had the night before. Chloe stood at the threshold watching Noah eat a simple breakfast and felt something settle inside her, quiet and unfamiliar. She did not yet name it. She only knew that leaving immediately would feel premature, as if she were turning away before the question had fully formed. By the time they closed the door behind them to explore the area beyond the house, the decision had already begun to take shape, even if Chloe was not yet ready to admit it. In the days that followed their arrival, Chloe tried to keep her mind anchored to the story she had told herself on the drive down. They were only visiting. They were only assessing. She would take notes, consider costs, decide what could be salvaged and what could not. And then she would return to the apartment with the sense that she had at least looked behind the door the letter had offered. That was the intention she repeated whenever she felt the weight of the place settling onto her shoulders like an invisible coat. Yet the house resisted being reduced to a checklist. It did not behave like a ruin. It did not punish them with the rot and dampness Chloe had anticipated. It held itself together, not in a polished or welcoming way, but with a stubborn coherence, as though it had been built to endure neglect as well as weather. Each morning Chloe stepped outside and felt the sharpness of the air cut across her cheeks, and each time she re-entered the house, she felt the same steady neutrality wrap around her. It was not comfort in the way a heated suburban home offered comfort. It was something older and quieter, a refusal to surrender to extremes. She spent the first week moving through the rooms repeatedly, learning their arrangement by muscle memory. The lower level stayed cool, the stone floor always slightly chilled beneath her socks, but it never sank into cold. The upper levels felt different. As she climbed, even without thinking about it, she noticed her shoulders loosen. The air softened. It was subtle enough to be dismissed as imagination, yet consistent enough to return each time she made the ascent. She began carrying their supplies higher, first out of practicality, then out of preference, the way a person chooses a seat near a window without being able to explain why. Noah adapted in his own quiet way. He did not ask when they were leaving. He did not question the lack of familiar conveniences. He followed Chloe through the house, exploring corners and passages with cautious curiosity, then settled into patterns, eating at roughly the same times, reading by the same window, arranging his small collection of toys in a line along a stone ledge, as if establishing territory. Chloe watched him closely for signs of discomfort she might have caused by bringing him somewhere so isolated. But what she saw unsettled her in an unexpected direction. He seemed less tense here than he had in the apartment, less braced against the noise that had always seeped through their thin walls. The silence did not weigh on him. It seemed to give him space. The problem, Chloe knew, was that space could become emptiness if left unchecked. She could not allow the days to turn into an unstructured stretch of isolation simply because the house felt steadier than the life they had left behind. Noah needed school. He needed other voices, other children, and the kind of repetition that shaped a child's sense of time. Without that, the house might become a cocoon that protected and diminished in equal measure. She found the county school through an outdated website that looked as though it had not been redesigned in years. The information was sparse: an address, a phone number, a short description that suggested one building served multiple grades. The nearest larger district was far enough away to make daily commuting unrealistic, particularly once winter deepened. This school, while still distant, seemed possible if the road remained passable. Chloe drove there alone first, leaving Noah at the house with books and instructions to stay inside. The road down the hillside was steep and uneven, and she learned quickly where the tires wanted to slip, where the shade held frost longer than the sunlit stretches. By the time she reached the lower valley, her hands were stiff from gripping the wheel too tightly. The school appeared almost abruptly, a low building set back from the road, surrounded by a wide gravel lot. A handful of cars were parked near the entrance, and beyond them, a yellow bus idled with a patient mechanical hum. The scene felt both familiar and foreign. Children gathered in small groups, bundled against cold that would have seemed excessive back home, their voices carrying sharply in the open air. Parents moved with the quiet efficiency of people accustomed to long distances in unpredictable weather. Chloe walked inside and found the administrative office small and plainly furnished. Paperwork was handled by hand, forms stacked in uneven piles. The woman behind the desk asked practical questions and offered practical answers. Chloe gave Noah's information, explained that they were staying at a property on a south-facing slope outside the main town. When she said the address, the woman paused briefly, her eyes lifting as if a thought had moved behind them. Her expression did not change into alarm or hostility, but something flickered there, the faintest tightening that suggested recognition. Chloe noticed it and felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the weather. Still, the process continued. Noah could start the following week. That first morning, Chloe drove Noah to school herself. The road was clearer than it would be later in the season, yet it still demanded attention. Frost lingered in pockets along the edges, and the curves on the descent required a careful speed. Noah sat in the passenger seat with his backpack held against his knees, watching the forest pass as though memorizing it. He did not speak much. Chloe wanted to fill the quiet with reassurance, with promises of easy friendship and quick adjustment, but she had learned that empty optimism could feel like betrayal when it failed. Instead, she kept her voice calm and her hands steady, letting the routine form itself. At the school, Noah stayed close to her. He moved with the small carefulness of a child who had learned that adults could vanish from his life without warning. Chloe knelt to adjust his jacket, smoothed his hair, and walked him to the door. His hesitation was brief but visible, a pause at the threshold as if he were listening for something beneath the ordinary sounds of school. Then he stepped inside, and the door closed behind him. Chloe returned to her car and waited longer than necessary. She watched children crossing the lot, watched a teacher directing them with practiced authority, watched the bus pull away on its route. Only after the building settled into quiet did she drive back toward the house. The road felt steeper on the ascent, the forest denser, the silence more complete. She wondered if she was being reckless. She wondered if she was doing what her mother had warned her against, making life harder out of stubbornness rather than necessity. Yet when she opened the house door and stepped inside, the air met her with its steady calm, and the tension in her chest eased in a way that made her realize how tightly she had been holding it. For the next several days, she repeated the routine: morning drives down, afternoon pickups, and in between, hours spent making the house more functional. She cleared debris from corners and alcoves, swept stone floors, wiped down shelves carved into the walls. She tested doors and latches, discovered which windows could be opened and which had been sealed by age. She organized their supplies in the cleanest, driest space she could find. She learned where the house stayed brightest during the day and where the shadows lingered, as if the structure had its own internal weather independent of the forest outside. Food became the centerpiece of planning. The nearest store was far enough away that trips required intention, and Chloe's instinct to calculate and ration returned with force. She made lists, counted cans, stretched ingredients. She cooked soups that could be reheated and thickened, bread that could be eaten in slices over several days. The stove they relied on was old but sturdy, and she learned its moods: how long it held heat, how quickly it cooled. The smell of simmering broth seeped into the stone on timber and seemed to rise through the levels as though the house carried it upward. Noah came home each afternoon with small observations rather than stories. He noted which teacher wore reading glasses, which classroom had a plant by the window, which boy at his table always sharpened pencils. He did not talk about friends. He did not complain about anyone being unkind. That worried Chloe almost more than direct distress would have. She knew how easy it was for a child to disappear inside himself, to become quiet not because he was content, but because he had decided there was no point asking for more. On the fourth morning, while Chloe waited near the edge of the parking lot as children gathered and the bus idled, she noticed a man standing apart from the clusters of parents. He wore the kind of clothing that belonged to long hours outdoors: heavy boots, a jacket that had been weathered by use, and a cap pulled low against the cold. His posture was attentive in a way that suggested he was scanning the road more than watching the children, as if the landscape itself demanded constant assessment. Chloe might have dismissed him as another parent, if not for the faded patch on his sleeve that marked him as part of the state's Parks and Forest Service. Their eyes met briefly. There was no warmth in the exchange, but no hostility either. It was the simplest recognition two strangers could offer each other in a place where strangers were rare. Chloe looked away first, focusing on Noah as he stepped toward the school entrance. The man waited until the children had gone inside, then moved with measured steps toward her. He did not approach with the eager curiosity Chloe had expected from people in isolated communities. There was no enthusiasm, no immediate demand for explanation. only the calm directness of someone used to dealing with the practical realities of terrain and weather. He acknowledged that she was new, not as a question, but as a statement rooted in observation. He referenced the house on the south-facing slope, identifying it with a specificity that made Chloe's stomach tighten. That he knew where she lived meant the place was known, and what was known about it might not be kind. Chloe confirmed the address and explained it had belonged to family. The man's expression remained controlled, his attention focused not on judging her, but on understanding what her presence meant for the landscape he monitored. He noted that the house had been unoccupied for a long time, that winters in that area could become severe, and that roads would worsen once snow settled. He gave his name, Owen Harper, and explained his role in patrolling the surrounding forest and managing access roads where possible. The information was delivered without drama. If she needed assistance with road conditions or safety issues, she could contact the ranger station, though he admitted that winter responses were not always immediate. The exchange ended as simply as it began. Owen stepped back, returned to his vehicle, and drove away. Chloe stood for a moment longer than necessary, watching the road where his truck had vanished. She realized she had been holding her breath. It was not the content of his words that unsettled her, but the implication that the house carried a history she did not yet understand, and that her arrival had registered as an event in the local consciousness. Over the following week, the rhythm of school began shaping Noah's days more firmly. He still moved through the mornings quietly, but the stiffness at his shoulders eased. He stopped hesitating at the door. He began remembering small details with more color: a drawing assignment, a math worksheet, a book someone had recommended. One afternoon he mentioned almost casually that a boy in his class had shown him where extra pencils were kept. The act itself was minor. Chloe felt its significance anyway, holding it carefully as evidence that Noah was beginning to find a place, however small. Winter began to gather with slow authority. Nights grew colder, and the first thin layer of snow appeared on the hillside one morning like a warning rather than a celebration. Chloe tested the road and found it slick in shaded curves. She drove more slowly, learning the feel of the car's tires on frost, memorizing where meltwater might refreeze. Each trip became an act of attention that left her exhausted by the time she returned. Yet the exhaustion was different from the weariness she had known in the apartment. It was physical rather than emotional. It felt honest. Owen returned one afternoon when Chloe was struggling to free a door that had swollen with age. She heard a vehicle crunching to a stop below and stepped outside to see his truck parked near the lower entrance. He stood beside it holding a small box. His explanation for being there was brief and matter-of-fact. He had been in the area and thought it made sense to check in before the season worsened. The box contained practical food: potatoes, onions, canned meat, apples. Chloe stared at it as though it were something fragile. Pride rose in her, sharp and instinctive. The old fear of being seen as incapable. Yet the hunger in their pantry calculations rose too, and beneath both was the reality that winter would make every resource more valuable. Owen's reasoning was simple. Roads would soon be unreliable. It was easier to bring supplies now than later. He did not frame it as charity, did not ask for gratitude, did not linger to make the gesture meaningful. He handed over the box and turned back toward his truck as if the exchange were merely another part of preparing the region for the season. That evening, Chloe cooked a proper meal with ingredients that felt almost luxurious after weeks of stretched provisions. The stew simmered for hours, thickening into something that smelled like endurance transformed into comfort. Noah ate with a focus Chloe had not seen in a long time, his appetite returning as if the warmth of the house had awakened it. Later, as he worked on homework, Chloe watched him from across the room and realized that his silence had changed. It was no longer the guarded quiet of uncertainty. It was the quiet of concentration, of a child adjusting to new surroundings by observing carefully before stepping fully into them. Owen's presence became part of the weeks that followed. He did not come every day, but often enough that Chloe began to anticipate his visits as she anticipated the bus route and the shift in light. Sometimes he brought supplies. Sometimes he arrived simply to ask whether the road had iced over, whether she needed information about weather patterns, whether the house's entrance path was drifting over. His visits remained brief, purposeful, unadorned. Chloe did not think of him as rescue. She thought of him as someone whose life had always included the forest's demands and who had made a place for those demands within routine. By the time the first heavy snow fell, Noah no longer asked about returning to their old apartment. The city and its edges had become distant in his mind, perhaps not erased but no longer immediate. He spoke instead about the hill behind the school and how it looked when covered in white, about the way the forest seemed to hold its breath after snowfall, about how the house stayed warm at night even when the wind sounded fierce beyond the walls. Chloe listened, aware of something she had not fully understood when she packed the car. They had crossed a boundary. The trip that was supposed to be temporary had already changed into something else. Winter did not arrive in a single dramatic sweep. It pressed itself into the landscape gradually, narrowing roads and shrinking the outside world until daily life became a series of careful decisions. Chloe found herself planning their days around school and supplies, around the house's internal steadiness, and the forest's external unpredictability. She still told herself they could leave if they needed to. She still held the idea of returning to the apartment like a key in her pocket. Yet every morning as she drove Noah toward the school and watched him step through its doors, and every evening as she returned to the stone house and felt its calm air meet her at the threshold, the key felt less necessary, its metal warming to her skin only because she held it so long. The season deepened, and with it the sense that their lives were no longer simply paused between decisions. They were being shaped, quietly and without permission, into a new form. Chloe did not yet know what the house truly was, or why it held winter at bay the way it did. She only knew that it had become the axis around which their days now turned, and that once a life begins to settle, even on uncertain ground, the idea of uprooting it again becomes harder to bear. By the time winter settled into its deeper rhythm, the house had ceased to feel unfamiliar in any practical sense. Chloe no longer had to think about where things belonged or how to move through the narrow passages without bumping her shoulder against stone. Her body had learned the logic of the place before her mind fully caught up. She knew which steps creaked, which sections of floor stayed dry after snowmelt, which shelves caught the light in the late afternoon. The house had become predictable, and in that predictability there was comfort. Yet familiarity brought with it a different kind of attention. Once Chloe stopped scanning the structure for obvious threats or failures, she began noticing subtler patterns, details that did not announce themselves, but repeated with quiet insistence. The most persistent of these was the way warmth behaved inside the house. It was not merely that the interior stayed temperate while the outside world froze. It was that the temperature shifted within the house itself in ways that felt deliberate rather than accidental. The lower level, where they cooked and ate, remained cool but never uncomfortably so. The air there felt dense and steady, as if anchored by the stone floor and the earth pressed against the walls. The upper levels, by contrast, carried a softness that Chloe found herself seeking out more often, especially in the late afternoons when the light faded early and the cold sharpened outside. She noticed that when she climbed upward, her breath slowed without effort, her shoulders relaxed. It was not dramatic enough to inspire wonder at first. It was simply consistent. At night, when the fire burned low and Chloe expected to wake to chill, she did not. The house held the day's warmth in a way that defied her experience. She tested it unconsciously, waking briefly and placing her hand against the wall, feeling the faint residual heat there. The packed earth did not feel inert. It felt like a reservoir, something that absorbed and returned energy on its own schedule. Chloe did not have the vocabulary to describe what she sensed, but she trusted her body enough to know it was not imagined. Noah noticed it too, though he spoke of it differently. He began carrying his school books to one of the upper levels after dinner, settling there to do his homework without being asked. When Chloe questioned him about the habit, he shrugged and said it felt better there. Warmer, quieter, he could focus. The explanation was simple, but it echoed Chloe's own unspoken reasoning. Without discussing it further, she rearranged one of the upper spaces to make it more usable, clearing debris and setting a small table near the wall where the light lasted longest. As the days shortened, Chloe spent more time indoors, not out of fear, but necessity. Snow made the forest impassable in places, and even Owen's truck had difficulty navigating the road after heavy storms. Supplies became precious. Meals were planned days in advance. The house, meanwhile, continued to respond to the season with calm indifference. The contrast sharpened Chloe's awareness. She began to move through the structure with deliberate attention, testing its moods the way one might test the current of a river before stepping in. It was during one of these quiet afternoons, while Noah was still at school and the forest lay muted under fresh snow, that Chloe noticed the irregularity. She had been clearing an upper wall of accumulated dirt and debris, working slowly to avoid loosening anything structural. Her glove brushed against a section of packed earth that felt different beneath her hand. Not softer, not cracked, but smoother, more uniform. She paused and pressed her palm flat against it, tracing the edge where texture shifted almost imperceptibly. At first she assumed it was an old repair, some attempt by a previous occupant to reinforce the wall. But the more she examined it, the less the explanation satisfied her. The surface was too carefully shaped, too evenly finished compared to the surrounding material. She fetched a small tool and worked cautiously, brushing away dirt rather than scraping. The outline of a square began to emerge, its edges reinforced with wood darkened by age. The panel had been sealed, not by accident or neglect, but intentionally, hidden beneath layers meant to disguise its presence rather than protect it. Chloe did not open it immediately. She stepped back, unsettled by the realization that the house still held spaces she had not been meant to see casually. This was not a forgotten cupboard or a collapsed niche. This was concealment. She waited until Noah returned from school before mentioning it, not wanting to alarm him, but unwilling to carry the discovery alone. Together they examined the panel, Noah crouching beside her with the focused interest he brought to puzzles and mechanical things. That evening, when Owen arrived, as he often did when the road remained passable, Chloe showed him what she had found. He approached the wall with the same careful attention he brought to unstable ground or damaged trails. He did not touch the panel at first. He studied it, his eyes tracing the edges, his posture alert but controlled. When he finally placed his hand against it, he tested its solidity rather than its surface. This was not damage, he concluded. It had been built this way. The wood framing was too precise, the seal too deliberate. Together they worked to open it without force, easing the panel away rather than prying it loose. Behind it was a narrow vertical channel extending upward beyond the reach of their candlelight. The space was too clean to be accidental. There was no soot, no smell of smoke. The walls were lined and finished, smooth enough to suggest frequent airflow rather than neglect. Owen tilted his head, studying the shaft. It extended both upward and downward, forming a spine that cut through the structure in a way Chloe had not previously noticed. It was not a chimney. It did not serve any obvious purpose by conventional standards. Yet standing there, with the candle flame wavering gently in response to unseen currents, Chloe felt a subtle certainty settle into place. The house was not simply arranged around the hillside. It was organized internally, guided by principles she had lived with but not yet recognized. Over the following days, they traced the channel's path through the house. It appeared and disappeared behind sealed panels, intersecting levels that otherwise seemed independent. Each section was constructed with the same care, the same intention. Near one of the uppermost levels, concealed behind another deliberately disguised wall, they found a small cavity. Inside it rested a metal box, its surface dulled by time but intact. Opening it felt like crossing a boundary Chloe had not known existed. The contents were wrapped carefully against moisture. Inside were papers bundled together, their edges yellowed but preserved. A leather-bound notebook lay among them, its cover worn smooth by handling. Chloe opened it slowly, aware that whatever it contained would change how she understood the place she now called home. The pages were filled with tight, precise handwriting. Diagrams covered entire spreads, cross-sections of the house drawn with meticulous care. Measurements were noted in the margins, accompanied by annotations that suggested ongoing refinement rather than a single finished plan. As Chloe read, a picture began to form. The house had not been built as a simple dwelling. It was an experiment, a response to environment rather than convenience. The notes described principles Chloe recognized intuitively from her own experience of living there. Heat rising and being guided rather than trapped. Earth used not as an obstacle, but as an ally, absorbing and releasing warmth over time. Exposure minimized, not to isolate the interior from the world, but to moderate its influence. The design was not improvised. It was the result of careful thought, tested and adjusted through observation. The legal documents included with the notebook complicated the story further. Deeds and registrations written in older language framed ownership in terms that felt unfamiliar, emphasizing stewardship and responsibility rather than control. The original builder appeared to have envisioned the house as a demonstration of applied knowledge, something meant to endure beyond its immediate use. Yet subsequent records showed a gradual erosion of that intent. Transfers occurred without understanding. The structure's purpose was forgotten, reduced to a curiosity, then to an inconvenience. Owen took the discovery seriously. His professional distance softened into focused engagement as he photographed pages and noted dates, recognizing the rarity of what lay before them. He explained that structures like this, intact and undocumented, were uncommon. Early examples of environmental engineering often existed only on paper or had been heavily altered by later occupants. This house, by contrast, had survived largely untouched, not because it had been protected, but because no one had understood it well enough to change it. The realization shifted something fundamental in Chloe's understanding of her situation. The house was no longer just a shelter that happened to suit their needs. It was a system, one that had been designed with winter in mind, with an awareness of forces larger than any single occupant. The warmth she had felt, the steadiness Noah responded to, were not accidents. They were outcomes. With that understanding came a new vulnerability. If the house was significant, it would not remain unnoticed forever. The very qualities that made it livable and resilient could attract scrutiny from systems that did not accommodate ambiguity or exception. Chloe felt the weight of that possibility settle over her in the days that followed. The discovery did not bring uncomplicated relief. It brought responsibility. The pressure arrived sooner than she expected. An official notice appeared, delivered in language Chloe recognized immediately from years of navigating institutions that viewed individual circumstances as obstacles to be resolved. An inspection was scheduled. Concerns were raised about safety, zoning, and habitability. The phrasing was careful, neutral on the surface, but Chloe understood its implication. The house and their right to remain in it was now under question. Fear returned with a sharpness that surprised her. The house had given her a sense of ground beneath her life that she had not felt in years, and now that ground seemed to tremble. She imagined being told to leave, to uproot Noah again, to explain why the place that had finally allowed them to breathe was no longer permitted to exist on its own terms. Owen did not minimize the situation. He explained how inspections worked, how classifications could be challenged but not ignored. He also explained the power of documentation, of presenting evidence clearly and correctly. The notebook, the diagrams, the land records, all mattered. They could shift the narrative from one of risk to one of significance. He offered his help not as a personal favor, but as part of his responsibility to the land and its history. Evenings took on a new intensity. They spread the documents across the table, deciphering terminology, matching diagrams to physical spaces. Chloe learned to translate lived experience into measurements and explanations. Noah listened from the edge of the room, absorbing more than she realized. He traced paths through the drawings with his finger, asking questions that forced both adults to articulate what they were still piecing together. The house, Chloe realized, was no longer just the backdrop of their lives. It was an active presence, a testament to a way of thinking that had survived through neglect rather than recognition. Someone had built it with an eye toward the future, even if they could not have known who would inherit it. As winter pressed in around them and the inspection date loomed, Chloe felt the weight of a choice forming. Whatever happened next, she would not walk away without trying to protect what had been entrusted to her, intentionally or not. The house had revealed its secret. In doing so, it had changed the terms of their stay. The notice arrived on a morning that seemed almost gentle in its restraint. Snow lay undisturbed along the slope, softening the sharp lines of stone and earth that had defined the house all winter. The forest stood quiet beneath a pale sky, neither hostile nor welcoming, simply present. Chloe found the envelope wedged into the doorframe, its paper thick, its edges already damp where frost had begun to melt. She recognized the texture immediately. Official correspondence carried a weight that had nothing to do with paper alone. She read it standing in the doorway, the cold seeping through the soles of her boots as the words rearranged themselves into meaning. An inspection had been scheduled. Preliminary concerns were noted regarding structural safety, residential suitability, and zoning compliance. Temporary occupancy was under review pending further assessment. The language was precise, careful to avoid direct accusation, yet Chloe felt the intent settle heavily in her chest. This was not curiosity. It was authority preparing to assert itself. She closed the door and leaned back against it, the solid wood pressing between her shoulders in the cold outside. For a moment she simply stood there, breathing slowly, trying to steady the familiar surge of fear that threatened to overtake reason. The house behind her felt unchanged, steady in the way it always had. Yet the knowledge that its future could be decided by people who had never lived within its walls made that steadiness feel suddenly fragile. Noah was still asleep on one of the upper levels. Chloe considered leaving him there, letting him wake without the weight of uncertainty she now carried. But postponement, she had learned, only sharpened anxiety. By the time he joined her in the lower room, the kettle was already on the stove, its quiet hum grounding her in routine. She did not explain the letter immediately. She moved through breakfast with deliberate normalcy, knowing that the illusion of calm would not last, but valuing it while it could be maintained. When Owen arrived later that day, she handed him the notice without preamble. He read it carefully, his expression tightening in places Chloe could not immediately interpret. He did not dismiss it, nor did he catastrophize. Instead, he explained what the letter represented in practical terms. Inspections were tools. They could be used to ensure safety, but they could also be used to clear obstacles when something did not fit established categories. The house, with its unconventional design and undocumented history, did not fit. What mattered, he said, was framing. If the inspection focused solely on habitability under modern residential codes, the house would likely fail. Its narrow passages, irregular levels, and lack of conventional heating would invite scrutiny that could not be easily deflected. If, however, the structure could be presented as a historically significant example of early environmental engineering, the conversation would slow. Slower processes allowed for argument, for documentation, for compromise. Time in this context was not neutrality, it was leverage. The days that followed were consumed by preparation of a different kind than Chloe had known before. There was no physical labor to distract her, no immediate task whose completion could be measured by visible progress. Instead, she worked with paper and memory, translating experience into evidence. The notebook and diagrams were carefully organized, each page photographed and cataloged. Measurements were taken to match the drawings, confirming that the system described in ink still existed in stone and earth. Chloe learned to speak about the house in terms that felt foreign at first. She practiced explaining how heat moved through the structure, how the earth surrounding it acted as thermal mass, how the vertical channel functioned as a controlled airflow system rather than a hazard. She kept records of interior temperatures at different levels, noting their stability despite external fluctuations. The work demanded a precision she had rarely been allowed in her previous life, where survival left little room for documentation. Noah absorbed the tension, despite Chloe's efforts to shield him from it. He asked fewer questions than she expected, but he watched more closely. He noticed the way evenings stretched longer at the table, the way papers replaced books and quiet replaced casual conversation. When Chloe finally explained that people were coming to look at the house and decide whether they could stay, he listened without interruption. His response was simple and steady. He said he liked living there. He said he did not want to leave. Chloe held his hand longer than necessary, aware that his calm acceptance placed a responsibility on her that went beyond logistics. The inspection date approached under persistent snowfall. The road became increasingly unreliable, its edges narrowing under drifts that Chloe cleared daily. She cleaned the house obsessively, as if order might translate into legitimacy. She worried about the uneven floors, the unconventional layout, the ways the structure defied expectation. Each concern felt magnified, sharpened by the knowledge that others would soon view the house through a lens that did not value nuance. On the morning of the inspection, two vehicles arrived together. Chloe watched them climb the final stretch of road, their tires cutting careful paths through packed snow. One belonged to a county official she recognized from a brief phone conversation. The other carried a man she did not know, his clipboard already in hand as he stepped out. Their movements were efficient, practiced, suggesting familiarity with places that required judgment rather than curiosity. Chloe led them through the house, answering questions as they arose. She spoke calmly, though her pulse remained uncomfortably present beneath her skin. She acknowledged the absence of conventional systems without apology, explaining their alternatives with clarity she had rehearsed but never tested under pressure. The inspectors measured ceiling heights, noted the integration of earth into the walls, commented on the vertical channel with open skepticism. One of them described it as unconventional, potentially unsafe, a liability rather than an asset. Owen stepped in then, his presence shifting the tone of the exchange. He spoke not as a neighbor or a concerned acquaintance, but as a professional, framing the structure within a broader historical and technical context. He referenced early engineering principles, precedents in passive design, the rarity of intact examples. He presented the diagrams and documentation with deliberate care, allowing the evidence to speak before interpretation. The inspectors slowed. Their questions changed. They took photographs with greater attention, asked about dates and provenance rather than immediate compliance. Nothing was decided that day. The officials left with assurances that findings would be reviewed, determinations made after consultation. Chloe watched their vehicles disappear down the road, the sound of engines fading into the forest. The silence that followed felt heavier than the one she had grown accustomed to. It carried uncertainty rather than calm. The waiting that followed was more difficult than the inspection itself. Days stretched without news. Chloe maintained their routines with exaggerated precision, aware that normalcy was both comfort and illusion. Noah continued attending school, though Chloe found herself watching him more closely than before, as if memorizing details in case they were soon taken away. He sensed the tension, but did not let it dominate him. One evening, as they prepared for bed, he asked whether the house could be taken away from them. Chloe answered honestly that she did not know, but that they were doing everything they could. After he fell asleep, Chloe climbed to the upper level and stood alone. The warmth gathered near the ceiling, steady and patient, indifferent to paperwork and authority. She pressed her hand against the wall and felt the stored heat radiate back, a physical reminder of the intelligence embedded in the structure. The house had survived neglect and misclassification because it had been built with understanding rather than assumption. That thought steadied her when nothing else could. The call came a week later. Preliminary findings acknowledged the house's uniqueness. Concerns remained, but the documentation warranted further review. No immediate action would be taken. Additional assessments would be scheduled. Time, at least for now, had been granted. Chloe sat at the table with the phone still in her hand long after the call ended. Owen watched her from across the room, reading the relief in her posture before she spoke. "They were still there," she said finally. He nodded, acknowledging both the truth and its fragility. That night they ate together without much conversation. The simple act of sharing food carried a weight that felt newly earned. Outside, snow continued to fall, indifferent to human systems of control. Inside, the house held its warmth as it always had, waiting to see whether the people within it would be allowed to do the same. Spring arrived without urgency, as if it were testing whether it would be allowed to take hold after the winter it followed. The snow did not vanish so much as recede, thinning along the slope day by day, retreating into shaded pockets beneath trees and along the northern edges of the hillside. Meltwater traced temporary paths through the forest floor, carrying with it the remnants of what had not been anchored deeply enough to endure the freeze. The land adjusted itself slowly, cautiously, revealing patches of earth and stone as though emerging from a long-held breath. Inside the house, the transition was quieter still. The steady warmth that had carried them through the deepest cold softened rather than disappeared. It became less insistent, less noticeable, yet no less present. Doors that had resisted movement in winter loosened. Light lingered longer in the upper levels, drifting through the small windows and settling into the rooms as if it had always belonged there. Chloe noticed these changes with the same careful attention she had learned to give the house all winter, aware that stability, once felt, could be lost as quietly as it arrived. The letter came on an afternoon that felt ordinary enough to pass without remark. It was thinner than the notices that had preceded it, its tone markedly different. Chloe read it at the table where documents had once been spread in anxious piles, her hand resting unconsciously against the worn wood. The language acknowledged the house's uniqueness without exaggeration. It recognized the structure as a historically significant example of early applied environmental design, noting the rarity of its intact systems and the clarity of its original intent. Residential use would be permitted under specific conditions. Preservation requirements would apply. Modifications would need to honor the original construction. There would be oversight, documentation, responsibility. Chloe read the letter twice, then a third time, absorbing its implications not as triumph, but as permission. What she felt was not exhilaration, but a deep settling relief that reached beyond emotion and into her body. The ground beneath her life, so long unstable, had finally stopped shifting. There was no surge of celebration, no impulse to mark the moment as an ending. It felt instead like the confirmation of something that had already been quietly decided. Noah understood before she explained it fully. He noticed the change in her posture, the way she exhaled without immediately bracing herself again. When she told him they were staying, truly staying, he nodded once, seriously, as if confirming a conclusion he had already reached. There were no questions, no hesitation. That night he fell asleep without the restless vigilance Chloe had seen so often in the past, his trust no longer provisional. Life adjusted itself accordingly. The school year continued without interruption, the daily drive becoming less fraught as the road dried and widened. The forest shifted from obstacle to presence, its sounds changing with the season. Noah walked more confidently now, his place among the other children no longer tentative. He brought home stories that stretched beyond observation into belonging, complaints about homework, opinions about teachers, plans that assumed continuity rather than departure. Chloe listened with a quiet gratitude that did not need to announce itself. The house settled into its new chapter with the same restraint it had shown in every season. Repairs were made with care rather than haste. Chloe reinforced an entrance where winter had tested it, cleared drainage paths revealed by snowmelt, adjusted interior spaces to better serve their daily rhythms. Each change honored the structure's original logic rather than overwriting it. The documents that had once been hidden were stored safely now, accessible but not displayed, part of the house's memory rather than its decoration. Owen's role shifted without formal acknowledgement. He no longer arrived with supplies, not because they were unwelcome, but because they were no longer necessary. Instead, he stayed. Sometimes he came for dinner, sometimes to help mend a wall or assess a drainage line, sometimes simply to sit with a mug of tea as the light faded. His presence was unremarkable in the way that signaled permanence. He did not frame his continued involvement as sacrifice. He spoke of adjustments to paperwork, to his own responsibilities now that his professional connection to the house was documented. There were consequences, he admitted, risks he would accept without complaint. He described it not as a choice made for others, but as alignment with what he already understood to be worth preserving. They did not define their relationship. There was no need. It unfolded through shared tasks and unspoken agreements, through evenings that ended without urgency and mornings that assumed each other's presence. Noah accepted Owen without hesitation, making space for him as he did for everything that felt stable and sincere. The house, which had once seemed to exist apart from human bonds, now held them without distinction. As the days lengthened, Chloe found herself standing still more often, struck by how ordinary the moments had become. The fear that had once framed every decision was gone. In its place was something quieter and more durable, a confidence rooted not in certainty, but in resilience. She understood then that the house had not saved them in any dramatic sense. It had not erased hardship or rewritten the past. It had simply provided the conditions in which saving themselves became possible. The system that had protected them from winter now revealed its balance in warmth. As the sun grew stronger, the earth moderated the interior, keeping excess heat at bay with the same patience it had shown in releasing warmth during cold. Chloe noticed how the house responded not to extremes but to rhythm. It worked with the world rather than against it, absorbing and releasing, adjusting without urgency. One late spring evening, they sat together on the upper level with the windows open. The air carried the scent of thawed earth and new growth. The forest sounded alive again, layered with movement and possibility. Dinner had been eaten and cleared. Noah leaned back in his chair, content in the loose, unguarded way of someone who no longer needed to monitor his surroundings for danger. After a long pause, he remarked that the house was warm, not just in the moment, but always. Chloe waited, letting him find his own words. He continued, noting that it was not because the house was old, but because someone had thought carefully about it, as if they had known winter would come. Chloe reached across the table and squeezed his hand, understanding more in that moment than she could articulate. The house was warm because it had been built with attention, with respect for forces larger than any single season or owner. It endured because it worked with the land rather than imposing itself upon it. It had waited quietly through years of neglect and misunderstanding, until someone stayed long enough to notice what it offered. As the light faded, Chloe felt no urge to mark the moment as an ending. There was nothing to conclude, no lesson to underline. The story did not resolve into triumph or closure. It simply continued, grounded now in something that could carry weight. The house had stayed, and because of that, so had they. If this story stayed with you, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. More stories like this are coming soon, each one exploring quiet places, hidden histories, and lives changed by unexpected turns. Watch the next video on the channel to continue the journey and explore other stories you may have missed. And if you feel this story could resonate with someone else, share it. Sometimes the right story finds the right person at the right time.